Should a Christian just be themselves? This is an interesting question that has been flowing around in my mind for a long time now. It's a big question in the culture that I live in, maybe you live in too. This idea that we should all just be ourselves. Everyone should just be themselves. It's one of those phrases that on the surface sounds good, sounds meaningful, but the deeper you look into it, the more you start to really question the morality behind the statement. And I want to spend a minute digging into that, as I also mentioned that I have written a book. I am an author. I have been for a few years now. This is an old book of mine that it's not that old. It's only like 3 years, but super proud of this book still. I do write with a pen name. It would make sense if you read it. I did the cover myself, actually, even though I'm not that good of an artist. But this is not the book I just published. It's a different book. And if you're interested, there is a link in the description. And a big reason of why I wrote that book is due to my thoughts and opinions on this statement that's been really huge in my culture, this idea of be yourself. And I'm going to talk about that. The phrase in my mind is the kind of phrase that objectively by itself means nothing, is vapid, but yet people still attach a lot of meaning to it. And so when they hear that phrase, it means something to them, that they attach whatever they need it to mean to that phrase, and that it brings up just these feelings and emotions when they hear that phrase, and that's what it means to them. When on its own, be yourself, objectively doesn't make a lot of sense. How can you be anything other than yourself? You just are yourself all the time. It's the kind of phrase that really means something more than what it's saying on the surface. Be yourself doesn't just mean be yourself, it means something else. And everybody understands that to some degree, although subliminally. People might not actively, consciously understand that more is being said in that phrase than just the two words in it. And I see it as something of a half-truth, something that has a lot of good in it that's been overshadowed by how it's been used and co-opted by forces that don't have your best interests in mind. I first started to think of this more seriously when I was in high school, many years ago. And I really started to grapple with this idea of be yourself, because I remember billboard signs saying just be yourself as I would go around to different towns and cities, and you'd see them on the highway. There's commercials all about promoting your self-identity, just to be yourself. And as I thought about this philosophy behind the phrase, I thought about why it didn't make a lot of sense to me. The idea is that you are, at your core, a good and complete person, but outside sources have made you worse somehow. They've corrupted you in some way, or maybe they've forced you to be like someone you're not, so on and so forth. This idea, if you're read up on history, is stemming from more of a socialistic kind of worldview, that people are inherently selfless and good, but society corrupts them. And I would hear a lot of people around me when I was in high school who would say, that they would put on a mask and pretend to be somebody that they're not, just for others. They pretend that they're better than they actually are, healthier than they actually are. They're suffering from mental health, but they put on a persona when they're in public. And I always thought that was kind of strange. You just are who you are. If you constantly put on a mask around other people, that is just part of who you are. You're not hiding who you are. Just part of who you are is to hide part of who you are. And that might not make any sense, but my point is, there is no real you hidden under the fake you. All of who you are is just you. I want a quick mention here the difference between the socialistic worldview and the more traditional worldview in this regard. The socialistic worldview being that humans are innately good and complete and society corrupts them, whereas the more traditional view is that humans are innately selfish and society civilizes them. And honestly, I would argue if you feel like you're going around with a mask on, hiding your true self, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's the inner animal inside you that's being held back by civilization. Not every part of you needs to be expressed all the time. There's parts of us that are not good, and society should keep us from expressing those parts. I don't believe, unlike more modern socialistic thought, I don't believe that self-expression is necessarily the end-all, be-all, best, amazing thing, that it's the ultimate good. It certainly is a good thing, but there should be limits on it. The idea also assumes that any bad part of who you are is not truly part of who you are. And truly who you are is all good, and any bad part must have been forced upon you by others or by circumstances and is just not really you. And so then therefore, the way to fight back against the bad part of yourself is to lean in more into the good part of yourself, which, as the idea posits, is the real authentic you. That the authentic you is perfectly good. Now, of course, this kind of bleeds into the modern viewpoint we see in our cultures today, that good and evil aren't really a black and white thing, that good's not really good, evil's not really evil, it's kind of gray and it's subjective, and what's good for me might not be good for you. And again, there's a tiny shred of truth in there somewhere, but that ideology is mainly used to just promote this idea that who you are is genuinely good, and nobody can prove you wrong, because even if you're different than me, your subjective truth is that you're good. And so nobody can ever prove that you're a bad person if you've decided that you're a good person, if all of your morality is subjective anyway. If this is getting really confusing, don't worry, I'm going to try and piece some things together here. And by doing so, I'm going to contrast this worldly view of being yourself with a more Christian view of be yourself. In a more Christian view, we would argue that God has made us, and that what God originally made was good, but yes, sin has caused us and the world to fall, and that has created a corruption within us that turns us from better people that we could be into worse people. But the difference is that this sin is not an external outside force in society making us bad. It's our own, it's who we are at our core that's making us bad. We aren't inherently good and having society corrupt us. We have something inside us that is inherently good, but we corrupt ourselves. If left to our own devices, we have the opportunity to be perfectly good, but we, through our actions, our choices, our thoughts, hold ourselves back from reaching that level of goodness and corrupt ourselves. And it's not always somebody else's fault. Sometimes it's genuinely who we are that leads to our own corruption. And this leads to the second issue between the two. The world would have us believe that we are inherently good, but society corrupts us. Whereas a Christian point of view is that we are inherently, authentically corrupted, and only Jesus can turn us into better people. That only Jesus can cleanse us of that corruption. Rather than a worldly view, which would be that we can cleanse our own corruption by detaching ourselves from the societal issues that we believe are corrupting us. If we lean in more to ourselves, then we will cleanse ourselves of the corruption. Whereas in Christianity, we are supposed to die to ourselves and seek Jesus, to forsake ourselves in hopes that Christ will cleanse us. And yet, there is still a shred of truth in the be yourself narrative. In a sense, yes, I am who I am, and I shouldn't let other people tell me who I should be or how I should act. Not always, anyway. Sometimes it's perfectly acceptable for other people to tell someone how they should act and what they should do. When I was in high school, I remember thinking to myself, we only tell people to be themselves if who they are is somebody that we would find acceptable in our society. So to speak, think of a pedophile or a rapist. You would never tell one of them to just be themselves. You want them to change. You want them to change who they are. Now, you might believe that society has corrupted them to act the way that they do, but you would still, I highly doubt anybody would ever tell someone like that to just be themselves. Because obviously, you want to change who they are, to be better people. So when society tells us to just be ourselves, what it's really saying is that we should be ourselves, but only if society approves of the you that you seek to be, which gets into another hidden meaning behind the phrase be yourself. The idea that you decide who you are, that your identity is entirely decided on what you want it to be. And this is just simply not true. From a Christian point of view, it's not true. And from a scientific view, it's not true either. Yes, there is part of your identity that you get to choose. But there's also a huge part of your identity that you don't get to choose. How you were born, what color your skin is, how your body functions, where you were born. There's a lot of things you can't control, you can't choose, that are going to lean into your identity. For me personally, I have white skin, I'm Caucasian. I can't change that. I've always been that way, I always will be. That is a part of my identity. Now, I can stress that or unstress that, I can lean into that or not. It doesn't matter, it is just part of who I am. Well, it matters somewhat, obviously. I can choose to be racist or not, so to speak, but at the end of the day, my identity will always, at least in part, factor in that I am Caucasian, because that's just part of my identity, whether I choose for it to be or not. But some part of my identity I can choose. I like reading manga and watching anime. I chose to like those things. I choose every day to still engage in those hobbies, and that's part of my identity that I have chosen. So which one of those things is being referred to when I'm told to be myself? To lean into that I'm Caucasian or lean into the hobbies I enjoy? And one is more me than the other. Me being Caucasian is more me than my hobbies. My hobbies may change over the course of my life, but I will always be Caucasian. The kind of clothes I wear will change over the course of my life, but I'll always be male. I can't change that. So when I'm told to be myself, it sounds like I have a choice to make. It sounds like I'm currently choosing not to be myself, and that I should make changes to be more like myself. But that, and not to get too philosophical here, but that assumes that there's this ideal version of me that exists in my mind that I can just choose to be, that I'm currently not choosing to be. My identity, in part, is going to be ever-changing throughout my life. Part of it won't, but part of it will. And who I am as a person is going to change and develop and grow over the course of my life. I can't just choose one day to be myself and then for the rest of my life and then myself. Being myself is a journey that takes an entire lifetime, because the you in yourself isn't a static thing. It's an identity that changes, and it should change. Part of it anyway. The corruption, that should change. So let me point out what a Christian response to be yourself would be. Instead of be yourself, a Christian might say, be like Christ, or be like the person that God has made you to be. In those instances, we put the focus on God instead of yourself. And also in those instances, it's more clear what action you can take, what choices you can make to actually be more like Jesus or like the person you're meant to be. So to summarize, the world says, be yourself because you get to choose who you are, and society has tried to force you to be like someone you're not. Whereas Christianity posits that you should be the person that God has made you to be, because God decides what your identity is, and you yourself have corrupted the personhood that God has designed you to step into. There is an ideal version of yourself, but it's in Christ. It's designed by God. It's not something you choose to come up with on your own. The truth is, the corruption, the sin, the mistakes, the bad choices, those are part of who you are. They just are. And that's not society's fault. Sometimes it is, but it's not always. More often than not, it's not the fault of society. So you shouldn't be yourself, because you're fallen. You're sinful. What you should be is more like Christ, more like Jesus. Christ says, deny yourself. The world says, be yourself. I think by now you can understand the difference between the two. And that's why I wrote Bubba, which is the book I just published. And the book, one of the major themes is identity and the philosophy behind the idea that we can choose who we are, and what sort of impact can come from a societal narrative that every individual within the society should seek to just be themselves and to cut themselves off from the systems within society that they believe are corrupting them. Essentially shifting the blame of your wrong actions onto a societal system rather than taking responsibility for your own choices. I wish more people could understand and see the vapid morality behind so much of what is in our culture today. And maybe you live in a different culture that's totally different than the one that I live in. But so many people just latch on to meaningless phrases that they don't even really think that hard about. The idea of be yourself sounds good on the surface, but if you really take a minute to think about it, it doesn't really mean a lot. And everything that it does mean isn't very good. I don't want to be myself. I know who I am, and I'm not perfect. What I want to be is better than who I am. I want to be me, but better, in a sense. I want to hold on to parts of myself that are unique, that God has given me, the talents and the gifts and the personality that God has uniquely given to me alone. But I also want to understand that my identity, then therefore, is from God. He decides who I should be. And so I want to go to him and seek his advice on how I ought to change in my life. So this book that I wrote has a lot to do with a lot of issues that have been plaguing my culture recently, and my thoughts about them and my frustrations about them. The major one being the idea that we should all just be ourselves and lean into the subjective truth that we decide that we live in, and all of the ridiculousness that can come of that. And I know this video might not have made a ton of sense. I probably could have gotten into a lot more detail on all of these things, but this isn't a philosophy class. I'm just throwing some ideas out there as to what I think. If you disagree, let me know. If you're curious and want to know more of what I think, you can ask as well. I will answer. And so I've written this book because if we don't tell people that they are corrupted and are in need of a savior, then they will believe this subjective truth narrative that they can do no wrong and that whatever they do is good so long as it's authentically them. And that's dangerous territory to be in. I still feel compelled to do something, even if it's not much. And that's why I wrote this book. If you are all interested in any of these topics I mentioned, in dealing with them, thinking about them, if you're a thinker like I am, if you care about these issues as much as I do, and you want to do your part to do something in all this, I recommend one thing you can do is read my book and recommend it to people, leave a review. I hope you enjoy it if you do choose to read it. And I've got other books too if you want to support me. This one is a fantastic book. I'm proud of it. And I was given a gift to tell stories and to write from God. And I want to use that to better the world and further his kingdom. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I would appreciate it very much if you choose to support me in that way. I do want to mention that one of the reasons I haven't been making a lot of videos recently is because I'm getting married, which is very expensive, but also exciting. So needless to say, I would very much appreciate any support. And thank you again for watching the video. And if you have any ideas for what I should make videos for next, let me know. And as always, read your Bibles and watch some anime.